The train stopped running at 0040, and Kenji Sato had the tunnel to himself, or believed he did. He was 49 years old, a maintenance inspector for the Musutafu Transit Authority, and the work had long ago stopped being anything but routine. Quirkless, one of the 20%, though he rarely thought of it that way anymore. He walked the dead track between Akota and Central with a hand lamp and a clipboard, and the particular patience of a man who had checked the same rail joints for 2 decades and expected nothing. The air down here was always the same, cool, mineral, faintly electric where the third rail slept. Water ticked somewhere off to his left, the slow arithmetic of a city that leaked. His footsteps came back to him flattened, swallowed by concrete. He had reached the maintenance alcove at kilometer marker 9 when the wall began to breathe. That was the only word he could find for it. Later, when men in commission suits made him say it 4 separate times into 4 separate recorders. The concrete of the tunnel wall, old poured concrete, laid before he was born, veined with the hairline cracks of 100 small earthquakes, was moving, not falling, not bulging inward under water pressure, the way he'd been trained to fear. It shivered, the way the surface of a pond shivers when something large moves beneath it, and from behind it came a sound he would never be able to unhear. A vast, wet, chittering scrabble, a million small claws working stone, and under that, a low grinding hum that he felt in his molars more than heard. The hand lamp shook in his grip. He told himself it was the trains, a late freight rerouted, the ordinary complaint of infrastructure. He told himself this even as a seam of green light, sick, luminous, the green of something that should not glow, traced itself down the wall in a jagged line, following the cracks, widening them, and the smell hit him. Rot and ozone and a chemical sharpness like a struck match dipped in sewage. His eyes watered, his throat closed. The wall came apart. It did not explode. It unmade, the concrete crumbling away in chunks and then in powder, as though decades of decay were happening in the span of 3 heartbeats, and where it had been was a hole, a raw black throat driven up out of the bedrock, and the green light poured out of it, and the smell, and the sound, and then the first of them came through. Kenji Sato's mind refused it in stages. A dog, he thought, a dog the size of a man, hunched. Then, no. The thing that pulled itself into the tunnel's mouth stood on 2 bent legs, and its body was covered in matted gray-brown fur, slick with filth, and it wore armor, crude riveted plates of blackened iron lashed over its chest, and it carried a jagged blade that dripped something that hissed where it struck the ground. Its face was a rat's face, long snout, yellow chiseled teeth, whiskers twitching, and eyes, red, wet, intelligent, hungry, that found him in the dark and fixed on him with the flat evaluation of a thing deciding whether he was food or threat or simply in the way. A naked, scaled tail lashed behind it. It opened its mouth, and what came out was not an animal's sound. It was speech, high, rapid, chittering, layered with clicks and squeals, and though he understood not a word of it, he understood the shape of it perfectly, because he had heard that tone from muggers and drunks and cruel boys his whole quirkless life. It was the sound of something that had found a small, weak thing and was pleased. Kenji Sato dropped the clipboard and ran. He ran badly, an aging man's run, one hand skidding along the filthy tunnel wall to keep himself upright, the hand lamp's beam jerking crazy arcs across the track. Behind him, the chittering multiplied. One voice became 10, became a chorus, and he heard the wet slap of clawed feet coming after him, unhurried, playful, the pace of predators who knew the prey had nowhere to go. He heard something whistle past his ear and strike sparks off a rail bracket, a thrown blade, or a dart, he never knew. He reached the emergency alcove, the one with the ladder and the sealed hatch that led up to a substation, the hatch he had personally inspected and cursed for 40 rusted years, and he threw his whole weight against the release wheel, and it did not turn. He would live. That mattered, later, to the people who counted such things, that the first human being to lay eyes on the invasion survived to describe it, because the hatch turned on the 4th desperate heave, because the thing chasing him at the front of the pack was distracted in that exact instant by the far richer smell of the sleeping city bleeding down through the ventilation, because he was quirkless and unimportant and not worth the chase when there was a whole world above to be tasted. He hauled himself up the ladder as the alcove below filled with green light and red eyes and a roar of numberless voices, and he did not look back, and that saved him. He came out into a substation yard under the ordinary sodium orange of a Musutafu night and lay on his back on the gravel, heaving, 49 years old and quirkless and alive, and above him the towers stood dark and full of sleeping people, and none of them knew. 8 kilometers away and 40 meters up, Shota Aizawa was awake because he was always awake at this hour, which was the entire tragedy of his life. He sat on the ledge of a shuttered office building in the underground hero's oldest habit, capture weapon coiled loose around his throat, goggles pushed up, watching a stretch of the entertainment district empty itself of its last drunks. Patrolling by exhaustion, the city ran fine without him. The city ran fine without most heroes, most nights, which was a truth the merchandise and the ranking charts worked very hard to obscure. He was thinking about nothing in particular, about a stack of ungraded quizzes, about a stray cat that had started meeting him on this ledge, when his agency phone lit with a priority tone he heard perhaps twice a year. Not a robbery, not a villain sighting. The transit authority, patched through emergency services, patched through the local hero net, and the dispatcher's voice had the specific flatness of a person reading words they did not believe. Subterranean breach. Underground. Multiple hostile unidentified. Requesting any pro in range. Aizawa was in range. Aizawa was always in range. That was the point of him. He reached the Ekota service entrance in 9 minutes, dropping through a ventilation grill rather than announcing himself at the door, because you learned things about a situation by not being expected. What he learned immediately was that this was wrong. The air coming up the stairwell was green, a faint luminous haze that clung to the walls, and it stank in a way that made his eyes stream and his lungs clench, and beneath the stink was noise, a tide of noise, thousands of small voices rising. He'd fought his share of quirks that did strange things to air and stone. He catalogued it as he descended, fast and silent, running the mental index every pro kept. Toxin emitter, sound-based, some kind of decay quirk operating at scale. He was already deciding how to shut it down, because that was what he did. He was the answer to every quirk that ever thought itself special. Erasure. Look at them, and the impossible becomes ordinary, and then you tie it up. He came out onto the platform at Ekota Station, and his index failed him for the first time in years. They filled it. The platform, the tracks, the tunnel mouths at either end. A seething, chittering mass of the ratmen, hundreds of them where his lamp could reach, and the sound of thousands more behind. And they had already been busy. The station's tiled walls wore a fur of green corrosion. A ticket machine had rotted where it stood, its plastic sagging like melted wax. And in the center of the platform, up on the crude standard of a captured signal pole, they had begun to raise something, a banner of stitched skin and bone marked with a rune, shaped like a horned skull, a 13-pointed thing that hurt to look at directly. The nearest of them saw him and shrieked, and a dozen heads swung toward the lone man in black on the platform edge, and Aizawa did the thing that had ended 1,000 fights before they began. He met their eyes, and he activated his quirk. His hair rose, his eyes burned red. Erasure flooded out of him, the null field that had canceled the quirks of villains who thought themselves gods, and he waited for the green light to gutter, for the corrosion to stop spreading, for whatever aberrant power animated these things to simply switch off under his gaze. Nothing happened. The green light did not dim. The corrosion crept on. The ratman did not falter, did not so much as flinch, because there was, he understood in a cold plunge, that would follow him for the rest of his career, nothing there for him to erase. Whatever these creatures were, whatever made them and moved them, and lit that sickly fire, it was not a quirk. It obeyed no law his eyes could revoke. He held the field anyway, forcing it, straining until the vessels stood out on his neck, and the familiar dry ache clawed up behind his eyes, and his vision began to blur, the point where he'd have to blink, where any quirk on Earth would have been long since dead. He pushed past it, held it until it hurt, until the tunnel doubled in his sight, on the desperate animal hope that this power was simply stubborn, that a fraction more would break it. It broke nothing. He was staring into the heart of a force older than the singularity that had given humanity its quirks at all, and it looked back at him and did not care. For one full second, the most reliable counter in Japanese hero society stood on a subway platform and was simply a tired man in a scarf. Then the Jezzails opened up, and he stopped thinking and started surviving. The first bullet cracked the tile a handspan from his head, and the report of the weapon that fired it was wrong. Too loud, too green. A crack of warp lightning wrapped around a lead slug. Aizawa was already moving, capture weapon snapping out to catch a signal gantry, hauling himself up and sideways into the dark above the platform lights where their aim would have to chase him. 3 more shots stitched the wall where he'd been, each one punching a fist-sized crater and leaving the edges glowing and smoking. Below, the horde surged toward the platform edge, clawing over one another in their eagerness, some of them trampled and vanishing under the churn, and he had time, barely, to be professional about his terror. Assess, they were not mindless. The shooters had held back, elevated on a heap of rubble at the far tunnel mouth, long-barreled guns braced on iron pavises, a shielding rat crouched beside each marksman. That was a weapon team, crude but real, discipline of a kind. The blades were poisoned, the ground still hissed where one had scraped it, and a thin green vapor rose from the cut in the concrete. The gas was a weapon, not a byproduct. He could see them working it, a cluster of hunched figures cranking a wheeled contraption that belched more of the luminous fog, and rolled it toward him along the platform, hurting him. And they were coming up from below, from a hole in the bedrock that no map showed, which meant this platform was not the invasion. This platform was the doorway. He keyed his agency line one-handed as he swung, and got it out in the clipped shorthand that would, within the hour, wake the Hero Public Safety Commission from Kyushu to Hokkaido. Ekoda Station, subterranean incursion, non-quirk hostiles, hundreds confirmed and rising, erasure ineffective. Repeat, erasure ineffective. Request All Might. He said the last 2 words the way a man reaches for the fire alarm. He did not call for the symbol of peace lightly. He had never called for him at all. A rat ogre came through the tunnel mouth. That was not the word he had for it. He had no word for it, but it was the true one, and he would learn it soon enough. It shouldered aside the smaller creatures like a man wading through surf, a thing of grafted muscle and stitched hide and iron, taller than a delivery truck, and where its right arm should have been there was instead a great crude blade fused to the bone, and where its eyes should have been there was that same warpstone green. Rusted chains bit into the meat of its shoulders, trailing back to a knot of handlers who jabbed it forward with barbed goads, and Aizawa filed that away too, cold and useful. They don't trust it either. It's a weapon they can barely hold. It lifted its head, and it bellowed, and the sound flattened the chittering of the horde into silence for one breath, and even the poisoned air seemed to still. Behind it, riding a palanquin of lashed-together bone and scrap borne on the shoulders of a dozen straining whip-scarred slaves, came a figure. Aizawa's eyes were dragged to whether he willed it or not. Smaller than the ogre, robed in filthy gray, a robe hung with fetishes, finger bones, warp tokens, a censer trailing green smoke, horned, 2 curling gray horns rising from a rat's skull, and clutching a staff topped with a shard of raw green stone that pulsed like a diseased heart. One of its eyes was clouded, ruined. The other was the cleverest thing in that whole seething pit, and it was also the most afraid, and the most cruel, and Aizawa understood with a patrolman's instinct that this was the mind. This was the one giving orders. Everything else was teeth. He watched it for the 3 seconds his perch allowed, and learned more in those seconds than in all the chaos before. The horde flinched from it as much as it obeyed. When the horned thing gestured, the nearest ratmen cringed away, as though expecting a blow along with the command. It rode above the filth, not in it. And when a shudder ran through the bedrock, a deep, distant groan, as though the hole they'd come from was widening on its own, the horned sorcerer's head snapped toward the sound, and its ruined face contorted into something Aizawa recognized across the vast gulf between species, because it was purely, nakedly human. Fear of the thing it served. Whatever commanded this creature was worse than the creature. Whatever it was afraid of was worse still. The horned thing lifted its staff and pointed it up into the dark at the swinging shape of the underground hero, and screeched a command, and the green stone flared, and a bolt of lightning that was not lightning leapt up to meet him. Aizawa let go of the gantry and fell. He fell because staying was death. The warp bolt vaporized the gantry he'd hung from, iron running like candle wax, a gout of green fire washing the ceiling where his heat and his heartbeat had been a quarter second before. And because 40 meters down the platform was a mass of enemies, but 10 meters down was a maintenance catwalk, and he'd marked it going in, because you always mark your exits. He hit it hard, rolled, felt something in his shoulder wrench with a white flash of pain, and came up running into the service corridor with the whole shrieking dark pouring after him. A poisoned dart took him across the ribs, a shallow burning line. He ignored it. A second buried itself in the doorframe as he wrenched around the corner. He ran the way he'd trained 100 students to run, not blind, not panicked, reading the passage for the next turn, the next grill, the next way up and out, and behind him the corridor filled with the scrabble of 1,000 claws and the wet triumphant chittering of things that had never once in their long history known the concept of mercy. He did not get to be a hero in that moment. He got to be a witness who lived. He got out because he was fast, and because they wanted the city above more than they wanted one exhausted man in a scarf, and because, though he could not have known this yet, the horned sorcerer on the palanquin had already lost interest in him, its clever, fearful mind racing ahead to grander things. For the sorcerer had a name, and the name was Thanquol, Grey Seer of the Council of 13, and its thoughts as it watched the man-thing flee were not on the escape but on the ceiling of the world, on the towers full of soft, screaming, defenseless prey it could smell through 40 meters of rock, on the glory such a conquest would win it before the council, on the rivals it would have to murder to keep that glory once it was won, on the burning eye of the horned rat that it could feel opening, slow and vast and terrible, somewhere behind the green light, watching to see whether its most faithful and most treacherous servant would triumph or die. Thanquol wanted very badly to triumph. Thanquol wanted, even more badly, to survive. These two desires had been at war inside its skull for its entire scheming life, and they were the only reason the world had lasted this long. It raised its staff again, and this time it did not point at a fleeing hero. It pointed up. And the digging began in earnest. Aizawa surfaced through a storm drain 9 blocks north, into a night that did not yet know it was at war. He came up filthy, shoulders screaming, ribs burning where the poison worked at the shallow cut, and he stood swaying in an empty intersection under a traffic light, cycling patiently through green and amber and red for no one at all. The city was quiet. A vending machine hummed. Somewhere a late train that would never come was still listed as on time on a glowing board, and under all of it, faint but growing, he could feel it now, a tremor in the pavement, in the soles of his feet, the deep grinding hum of a thing burrowing upward through the bones of the world. The first thing he did, before the medics, before the debrief, before the commission, was look up at the sleeping skyline of Musutafu and think, with the clarity of a man who has just watched his own certainties fail. Someone has to tell them it's already inside. Far beneath his feet, the Under-Empire kept coming. If you've read this far, you already know this channel runs on one thing, the collision no studio would ever greenlight. Subscribe so the next one finds you, and drop me a comment with the universe and the character you want thrown into the fire next. Any world, any face. Name both and I'll build it. All of it written by me. By 03 o'clock the word had reached the top of the world, and the top of the world did not know what to do with it. The Hero Public Safety Commission occupied a building that did not advertise itself. A gray government tower in central Tokyo whose upper floors held no signage, and whose lobby directory ended, publicly, at the 22nd floor. Above that was the machinery that ran Hero Society, the licensing bureau, the ranking board, the crisis response cell, the quiet office of the president herself, and the situation room where, on this particular pre-dawn morning, 11 of the most powerful administrators in Japan sat around a long table and watched a maintenance inspector named Kenji Sato weep on a monitor. They had put him behind glass at a regional office and recorded him 4 times, and the 4th recording was the one they were watching, because by the 4th telling the man had stopped trying to make it sound sane, and simply described what he had seen. Rats that walked upright and wore armor, green light that ate concrete, a hole in the bedrock that no survey had ever found. The administrators were, to a person, veterans of catastrophe. They had managed the aftermath of quirk-driven disasters that had killed thousands. They were not easily moved. And they sat in silence when the recording ended, because the man on the screen was quirkless and unimportant, and had no reason on earth to invent this, and because Eraserhead's field report, erasure ineffective, repeat, erasure ineffective, was clipped to the top of every folder on the table, and Eraserhead did not exaggerate. Eraserhead, in fact, was famous throughout the commission for the opposite, for reporting the impossible in the same flat tone he reported the mundane, which meant that when Eraserhead said his quirk had failed, it had failed. "Run it again," said the president. She was a small, precise woman with gray in her hair and no softness anywhere in her, and she had held her position through 3 prime ministers by never once permitting herself the luxury of panic. The station footage. Not the man. The station. They ran the station footage. It had come from a single surviving security camera at a coda, mounted high in a corner where the corrosion had not yet reached, and it showed perhaps 90 seconds before the lens fogged green and died. 90 seconds was enough. The administrators watched the platform fill. They watched the banner rise, the horned skull, the 13 points, a symbol none of their analysts could match to any known villain organization, any cult, any foreign actor. They watched a thing the size of a truck shoulder into frame and lift its head and bellow silently at the dead microphone. And they watched, at the very edge of the shot before the fog took it, a small robed horned figure carried above the swarm on the shoulders of slaves, and they watched the swarm cringe from it. And every administrator in that room who had spent a career reading power understood that they were looking at a command structure. This was not a natural disaster. This was not a quirk gone feral. This was an army, with officers, with a general, with a purpose. "Assessment," said the president. The head of the crisis cell was a broad man named Deputy Director Ishikawa, and he had the unenviable job of saying true things out loud. "We have no category for this," he said. "The registry classifies threats by quirk, emitter, transformation, mutation, everything we license, everything we counter, everything we train for, assumes a quirk at the root. Eraserhead's field test suggests there is no quirk at the root, which means every hard counter we have on file is potentially void. We don't know what stops these things because we don't know what they are." He paused. "The corrosion is not decay, quirk decay. Our chemists are still working, but the preliminary read on the residue is that it's something external. A substance. It's not being willed, it's being deployed. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. A quirk we could revoke, a chemical we have to fight. Numbers. Inspector Sato saw dozens. Eraserhead estimates hundreds visible and thousands audible, and explicitly flagged that the visible force was, quote, "the doorway, not the invasion." If he's right, and he's never wrong, then what came up at Ikoda is a scouting breach and the main body is still below. Ishikawa let that sit. "We have no map of below. The subway ends, the sewers end, the deep survey ends. Under that is bedrock we've never had a reason to look inside. And something has apparently built a civilization down there, or come up through one, and we found out about it 3 hours ago." The president did not raise her voice. She never did. Containment options. And here the room ran into the wall that would define the entire war, because containment was the thing Hero Society was worst at. Hero Society was built to win, visibly. It was built for the daylight rescue, the single powerful villain, the collapsing building, and the strong arm that held it up while cameras rolled and merchandise sold. It was a system optimized for spectacle and for the reassurance of a frightened public, and its greatest weapon was a smiling man who stood between the people and the dark and made them believe the dark could always be beaten. It had no doctrine for an enemy that came from underneath, that multiplied faster than it could be killed, that fought with poison and disease and machinery, and had no single throat to cut. Every option Ishikawa's cell had drafted in 3 hours assumed a front line. There was no front line. There was a floor, and the enemy was under the floor, everywhere, all at once. "We could seal the breaches," someone offered. "Collapse the tunnels, concrete, controlled demolition." "They dig," Ishikawa said. "You saw the man's account. They came up through 40 years of my colleagues' carefully inspected concrete in the span of a coffee break. We seal Ikoda. They come up in Musutafu Central. We seal Musutafu. They come up in Tokyo. We are not sealing a hole. We are trying to bail out the sea." The president was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the thing that every person in the room had been circling, and no one had wanted to be first to name. "Where is All Might?" All Might was already there. He had gotten the call the moment it left Aizawa's throat, because Aizawa had called him directly, not through the agency net, not through the commission, but to the private number that a handful of people in Japan possessed. And Toshinori Yagi had listened to 9 seconds of a colleague he respected saying, "My quirk did not work," and had been out the window of his apartment before the call ended. He arrived at Akoda Station as the symbol of peace, which is to say he arrived as a promise made flesh, 2 meters of golden impossibility, the smile that had ended more crises than any weapon ever forged, the presence that made frightened people unclench simply by existing. He came down through the shattered station entrance in a single bound that cracked the pavement, and he landed on the fouled platform in a crouch, and he looked up, still smiling, ready to say the words he had said 1,000 times. "It's fine now." Why? Because I am here, and the smile faltered. Because the platform was empty, not clean, never clean again. The walls wore their fur of green corrosion. The air was thick with the luminous rot fog. The ticket machine sagged, and the banner pole stood askew where they'd abandoned it. But the horde was gone. They had come up, and struck, and driven off the one hero who answered, and then, before the symbol of peace could arrive to be photographed defeating them, they had withdrawn back down the hole, back into the dark that no camera could follow, and taken their doorway with them. All Might stood alone on a poisoned platform holding a fist he had nowhere to throw. He understood, standing there, something that the commission was 3 hours of meetings away from articulating. He understood it in his body, the way a fighter understands a bad matchup before he can explain it. This enemy does not want to fight me. Every villain he had ever faced had, on some level, wanted the confrontation, wanted to test themselves against the symbol, to be the one who beat him, to matter. It was the engine that drove them, and the lever he used to defeat them. But the thing that had come up through this floor did not care about him at all. It had smelled him coming and gone back into the ground, because it was not here for glory. It was here for the city, and it would take the city the way water takes a low field. Not in one grand battle he could win, but everywhere, slowly, from beneath, in the places no hero was watching. He walked the platform. He found the crater where a warp bolt had melted a steel gantry into slag, and he crouched beside it, and he did not smile, because there was no one to reassure. He was very good, by now, at the difference between the face he wore for the public and the face underneath, the face of a dying man running on borrowed hours, one for all, flickering in a wound-scarred body that could hold the symbol together for less time each year. He had perhaps a handful of minutes of true power left in him tonight, before the smoke came, and he shrank back into skin and bone. He looked at the slagged steel, at the corrosion, at the hole in the world, and he thought, "This is not a thing I can end with one punch, and I am running out of punches." He straightened and pressed a hand to his side where the old wound sat like a cold stone, and made himself smile again. For the security cameras that might still be recording, for the city he could feel waking around him, for the terrible arithmetic of his own failing body, and he leapt back up into the night to find the man who had survived down here, because Eraserhead had seen this thing up close, and All Might needed to know everything he knew. 40 meters down, and 3 kilometers west of Akoda, in a chamber that had been a municipal water reservoir until 4 hours ago, and was now the temporary throne hall of a self-declared conqueror, Grey Seer Thanquol was extremely pleased with itself, and extremely afraid, in exactly equal measure, as it always was. The withdrawal had been its idea, and it had been a good one, and Thanquol wanted very much for everyone to know both of these things. The great golden man thing, the one the fleeing prey minds had screamed about, the one whose coming had shivered through the ceiling of the world like the tolling of a bell, that one was strong. Thanquol had felt its approach the way one feels a landslide, and Thanquol had not survived 13 assassination attempts, 4 purges of the council, and 1 personal and extremely unfair grudge from the horned rat itself, by standing in the path of landslides. Let the golden thing arrive and find nothing. Let it swing its fist at empty air and look foolish. Meanwhile the tunnels grew, The breaches multiplied and the soft, warm city above sat fat and unknowing on its floor of rotting concrete, ripe for the taking from a dozen directions at once. This was how Skaven made war. Not the honest, stupid way of the surface things, front against front, but the right way, the clever way, everywhere and nowhere, from below and behind and inside. Thanquol explained this at length to its assembled underlings, who cringed and nodded and agreed loudly, and every one of whom was already calculating whether this triumph could be stolen and this gray seer's skull mounted on a personal standard. Chief among the cringing was Warlord Critch of Clan Rictus, a scarred and enormous storm vermin who commanded the fighting rats and who had already decided, privately, that when the city was taken, it would be Critch who took it, and Thanquol who took the blame if anything went wrong. Beside him crouched a warp engineer of Clan Scryer, twitching and half-mad from a lifetime of proximity to the green stone, who cared nothing for glory, and everything for the delicious new materials this world offered, the strange metals in its towers, the crackling power in its wires, the endless fuel for engines Thanquol could not begin to imagine. And in the shadows behind the throne, unseen, unheard, breathing in a way that displaced no air, waited a black-shrouded figure of Clan Eshin, sent by masters Thanquol did not know to watch this ritual, and this conquest, and this gray seer, and to report, and, should the report warrant it, to act. Thanquol felt the assassin's presence the way it felt everything, dimly, paranoically, and correctly. It knew it was watched. It was always watched. It clutched its staff a little tighter, and drew a pinch of warpstone snuff into its snout, and let the green fire flood its skull with false courage and true genius, and it turned its clouded eye toward the ceiling of the world, toward the soft prey above, and it made its plan. The golden man-thing was strong. Very well. Thanquol would simply never fight it. Thanquol would take the city out from under it, poison the water, break the foundations, come up in 100 places at once, drown the surface heroes in numbers and disease, and warp fire until the great golden fool was running in a dozen directions and holding none of them, and by the time it understood, it had lost. Musutafu would already be a warren, and Thanquol would be its god, and the Council of 13 would have to forgive every past failure in the light of so magnificent a victory. It was, Thanquol reflected, a perfect plan. Almost nothing could go wrong. Somewhere far above and far below at once, in the green space behind the green light, an ancient and enormous attention shifted, very slightly, toward Musutafu, the way a sleeping predator's ear turns toward a promising sound. And Thanquol, who felt it, told itself firmly that this was a very good sign, and did not believe itself for a moment. At 0540, as the first gray light came up over a city that had slept through the opening of a war, three things happened almost at once. Eraserhead, arm in a sling and ribs wrapped, sat across a table from the symbol of peace in a commissioned safe room, and told him everything. The failed erasure, the weapon teams, the ogre on chains, the horned thing that even the Horde feared, and the thing the horned thing had feared in turn. The commission's chemists finished their analysis of the corrosion residue and came back with a result that made the president go very still. The substance was not in any database on Earth, matched no known element in expected proportion, and appeared, under certain instruments, to be faintly radioactive in a way that should not have been chemically possible. And in a warehouse district on the far side of Musutafu, 3 streets from an elementary school, a manhole cover rose silently from its seat, pushed from below, and a pair of red eyes looked up at the lightening sky, and looked back down, and chittered softly to the 1,000 waiting behind it that the coast was clear. The war for the surface had begun, and Hero Society still did not have a name for what it was fighting. They found the first warren by accident, and what they found broke something in the men who found it. The commission had moved fast once the president stopped asking questions and started giving orders, which she did the moment the word radioactive left the chemist's mouth. By dawn, a cordon of pro-heroes and self-defense force liaisons had been thrown around Akota and 3 other suspected breach points, and a decision had been made that would have been unthinkable a day earlier. They would go down. Not to fight. No one yet knew how to fight this. But to see, because the president had built her entire career on the principle that you could not manage what you refused to look at. And right now, Hero Society was refusing to look at the single most important fact of the war, which was its shape. How big? How deep? How many? The team that went into the Akota breach was small and expensive. A mole quirk pro named Burrow, who could read stone the way a sommelier reads wine. 2 combat heroes whose quirks worked on things other than quirks. A concussion blast emitter, and a woman who turned her skin to industrial diamond, and a commissioned surveyor with more courage than sense. They went in at 09 o'clock with lamps and gas masks and a lifeline of cable, and they were told to descend 100 meters, map what they could, and come back. They got down 230 before Burrow stopped, pressed his palm flat to the tunnel wall, and said, in a voice that had gone strange, "It's hollow. All of it. We're not near the bottom, we're near the top." Below them, the bedrock of Musutafu, the ancient, patient stone that a modern city had built itself upon in perfect ignorance, had been eaten into a vast three-dimensional maze, not dug in the last day. That was the thing that unmade the surveyor, the thing she could not stop saying afterward. It was old. Some of these tunnels were smooth-walled with the traffic of uncountable feet, floored with the packed filth of generations, hung with green glowing lichen that someone had cultivated. The breach at Akota had not created this. The breach had merely connected it, punched a doorway between the human world and an under-empire that had, impossibly, always been there, or had been there long enough that the distinction stopped mattering. The Skaven had not invaded Musutafu the way an army invades a country. They had surfaced in it the way rot surfaces in a wall that has been damp for years. Burrow, reading the stone, said the number that went into the report and then into the president's private nightmares. He could feel the hollows for perhaps 2 kilometers in every direction before the sensation blurred into a vast, indistinct seething, like standing at the shore of an ocean and being asked to count the water, and he said, "If these are all inhabited, and I can feel movement, I can feel it everywhere, then there are more of them under this city than there are people in it. By a lot. This isn't a raid. We're not the ones being invaded." He took his hand off the wall and looked at his teammates with the face of a man who has understood something too large to hold. "We're the ones on top of the anthill." They came back up. The commission classified the mapping data at the highest level available and did not release the number, because the number could not be released. Hero Society ran on the confidence of the public. The confidence of the public could not survive the sentence. There are more of them than there are of us, and they were always here. Grey Seer Thanquol received the news of the human intrusion with a shriek of outrage that sent 3 underlings diving for cover. They had come into its tunnels. The soft prey things, the surface fools who lived in the light and did not even know what walked beneath their feet, had sent their scouts down into the sacred dark of the Under-Empire as though they had any right, and worse, far worse, the part that made Thanquol's clouded eye twitch and its paws shake with fury and warpstone jitter. They had come down and looked and gone back up alive, which meant they now knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to be afraid the correct amount, which was the one thing Thanquol could not permit, because Thanquol's entire strategy depended on the surface things being afraid the wrong amount, panicked, scattered, fighting the doorways while the real work went on beneath them. "Kill-slay the next scouts," Thanquol commanded, and Warlord Critch bowed and agreed, and privately noted that the Grey Seer had just ordered him to spend Rictus warriors guarding tunnels instead of massing for the assault, which was either stupidity or cowardice, and in either case was more evidence for the standard Critch was already having built. "Yes, yes, Great Seer, none shall pass return." But Thanquol was already past the scouts, its mind leaping ahead in the way that made it genuinely dangerous whenever its terror briefly aligned with its ambition. The humans knew the tunnels were vast. Fine, let them know. Let them waste their golden champion and their armored heroes fighting down here, in the dark, where numbers won and daylight meant nothing, where the honest, strong surface things would drown in a sea of teeth. What Thanquol must prevent, what would ruin everything, was the humans learning the one true thing, the thing even most of Thanquol's own horde did not know, the thing the black-shrouded Eshin assassin in the shadows had been sent specifically to watch. This was not a conquest, not really, not to the power Thanquol served. The tunneling, the poison, the breaches, all of it was war, yes, and Thanquol wanted the city and the glory that came with it, wanted it desperately, dreamed of standing atop the tallest human tower with the Council of 13 forced to acknowledge its genius at last. But underneath that, in the deepest chamber of the deepest warren, 13 of Clan Scryer's most warp-mad engineers labored on the thing that was the real reason the horned rat had turned its burning eye toward this world at all. A great ritual engine, built around the very rift Thanquol's original spell had torn, the sideways wound in reality through which the Under-Empire had spilled into this place. The engineers were not sealing it, they were widening it, feeding it warpstone by the ton, tuning it like an instrument, opening the wound in the world wider and wider so that what waited on the other side, the true horde, the numberless legions of the Under-Empire, and behind them the attention, the will, the hunger of the horned rat itself, could pour through into a fresh, fat, undefended world and make of it one endless warren under one green sky. Musutafu was not the prize. Musutafu was the doorway, propped open, and the humans fighting so hard for their subway tunnels were fighting over the hinge while the door swung wide behind them. Thanquol knew this. Thanquol had been told this, by voices in the green fire, that it did not dare disobey. And Thanquol, being Thanquol, had already begun to wonder whether there might be some way to take the credit for the doorway and also survive whatever came through it, whether it might rule the city as the horned rat's chosen viceroy, or whether, if things went badly, it might flee back down its own tunnels and let the whole disaster be blamed on Warlord Critch. It clutched its staff and drew its snuff and schemed and trembled, and in the shadows, the Eshin assassin watched it scheme and tremble, and made its own quiet notes for masters who trusted no one, least of all a gray seer, who felt the horned rat's eye upon it, and thought, even now, of the exits. The Commission convened its emergency council at noon, and for the first time in its history, it convened the council publicly, or half-publicly, in the sense that the top 40 pro-heroes in Japan were summoned to a hardened facility and told the truth, or as much of the truth as the president judged they could carry and still function. They were not told the number Burrow had felt. They were told subterranean hostiles, non-quirk, in strength, with military organization, chemical and, the word was used carefully, anomalous weapons, operating from an extensive tunnel network beneath Musutafu. They were told erasure was ineffective, and that they should assume all quirk negation and quirk theft to be irrelevant against these enemies. They were told that the threat was expanding, and that the objective, for now, was to hold the surface, to detect breaches, protect civilians, and contain incursions, until a strategy for the tunnels themselves could be developed. The room's reaction was a map of Hero Society's soul. Endeavor number 2, the flame hero, sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and heard a threat that cannot be beaten by being the strongest, and hated it with his whole being, because his entire life was a monument to the proposition that enough raw power solves everything, and here was a war that proposed otherwise. He said little. He was already planning to disprove it personally. Hawks, the young winged number 3, listened with his easy smile and his hooded eyes, and understood faster than almost anyone in the room what he was hearing, because Hawks had been raised by the Commission to think in exactly these terms: threat, scale, cost, and what he thought was, they're telling us to hold a line against the ocean. He did not say it. He filed it, the way he filed everything, and began quietly deciding which of the Commission's reassurances were true. Mirko, the rabbit hero number 5, cracked her knuckles and grinned like a woman who had just been told the fight of her life was waiting underground, because it was, and because Mirko had never in her life met a hole she didn't want to go down and hit whatever was at the bottom. She would be, in the coming weeks, one of the very few surface heroes the Skaven learned to genuinely fear, precisely because she fought the way they did, savage, close, and without a shred of the honor they could exploit. And Aizawa, who was not supposed to be there, who had discharged himself from a commission infirmary against orders and stood at the back of the room with his arm in a sling, listened to the sanitized briefing and understood that the commission was doing the thing Hero Society always did, the thing that had made it strong and would now nearly get it killed. It was translating an unprecedented horror into familiar terms so that the machine could keep running. Hold the surface, contain incursions, protect civilians, good words, correct words, words for a war with a front line. There was no front line. He said so, quietly, from the back, into a pause. 40 of the most powerful people in Japan turned to look at the tired man in the sling, and he said, "You're planning to fight them like villains. They're not villains. Villains want something you can take away. Money, revenge, attention, a win. You beat a villain by taking away the want. These things want the ground you're standing on, and there's no gesture I can make, no fist All Might can throw, that makes them stop wanting it. We're not fighting an enemy. We're fighting a tide, and you don't hold a tide by standing on the beach and hitting the waves." He paused. "You either learn where the water's coming from and stop it at the source, or you drown politely, one breach at a time, telling the public everything's fine." The room was silent. The president looked at him for a long moment, and something passed over her precise, unmoving face. Not agreement, exactly, but recognition. She had thought the same thing at 0540, and had lacked the luxury of saying it, because her job was to keep the machine running, and a machine that stops to contemplate the ocean drowns faster than one that bails. "Then find me the source. Eraserhead," she said. "You went down there once and came back. That makes you the most qualified man in this room to tell me where the water's coming from. You'll have whoever you ask for." She turned back to the assembled heroes before he could answer, and her voice regained its flat command. "The rest of you hold the surface. I am aware it is not a strategy. It is what we have while we build one. Dismissed." They filed out to go and stand on the beach and hit the waves, because it was what they had, and because 40 of the strongest people in the country did not yet have anything better, and because underneath them, in the dark, the door swung slowly wider. That night, the Skaven answered the Commission's noon council with a council of their own, in the only language they knew. At 22:15, in 6 places across Musutafu at once, a shopping arcade, a train depot, a residential tower's underground parking, an elementary school's boiler room, a hospital's basement, and the outflow of a water treatment plant. The manhole covers rose, and the corrosion bloomed, and the horde came up into the world of the living, not to hold ground, not to win a battle, to terrorize, to poison, to teach the surface things that no floor was safe, and no place was deep enough to hide beneath, and at the water treatment plant, to do the one quiet thing that mattered more than all the screaming, to pour a barrel of Clan Pestilence's finest into the intake that fed 400,000 homes, and slip back down into the dark before anyone understood that the real attack had not been the one with the teeth. The heroes fought well that night. They saved most of the people. They would tell themselves that, and it would be true, and it would not be enough, because you cannot punch a plague, and by morning, the first of the sick would begin arriving at hospitals that did not yet know their own water was the enemy. Hero Society had met the Skaven in daylight and held the line. The Skaven had never intended to fight in daylight at all. In a chamber that appeared on no map and answered to no law, a man who had unmade the careers of symbols and the lives of successors sat very still and listened to a report that troubled him, and All for One had not been troubled in a long, long time. He did not go to the surface anymore. He had not needed to, for years. He sat at the center of a web that reached into every district of the country. Informants, doctors, brokers, the desperate and the ambitious, and the quietly loyal. And information came to him the way water comes to the lowest point in a valley, without his having to lift a hand. He had watched Hero Society for longer than most of its heroes had been alive. He had built pieces of it, on purpose, in order to have things worth breaking later. He understood it the way a surgeon understands a body he intends to open. And when the reports began to arrive, a subterranean incursion, non-quirk hostiles, Eraserhead's null field failing, the symbol of peace standing on an empty platform with nothing to punch. All for One felt, for the first time in years, the specific cold interest of a predator who has scented something it does not recognize. He had a man in the Commission's chemistry section. Of course he did. And through that man he received, hours before it reached the president's desk in final form, the analysis of the green residue, an element in no database, radioactive in a way that should not be chemically possible, corroding matter at a rate that decay quirks could not match. He held that report in his ruined hands, the hands that had held 1,000 stolen quirks, and he thought about it for a long time. Because All for One's power, the terrible engine at the root of everything he was, did one thing above all others. It took. It reached into a person and drew out the quirk that made them special, and made it his, added it to a stockpile centuries deep, and there was nothing in the human world he could not, given time and access, simply take. It was the fact around which his entire philosophy of the world was organized. Power was a thing that could be taken. Strength was a thing that could be accumulated. The strong took from the weak, and he was the strongest, because he took the most. This was not cruelty to him, it was physics. And now, 40 meters beneath a city he had spent decades quietly poisoning against its own heroes, there was a thing he could not take. He sent for a sample. It cost him 2 favors and 1 man's life, to get a vial of the green residue and a scrap of tissue from a ratman corpse the commission had not yet catalogued, smuggled out of a morgue in a cooler, and he had these things brought to him, and he examined them in the only way that mattered. He reached out with his power, the power that had never in his long life failed to find a quirk to grasp, that had peeled the special from the ordinary in men and women and children without number, and he reached into the dead flesh of the ratman, seeking the factor that made it what it was, the thing he would draw out and hold and understand and, if it pleased him, keep. There was nothing there to take. Not nothing. The corpse was saturated with power, reeked of it. The green stuff sang in its bones like a struck bell. But it was not a quirk. It was not built the way quirks were built, did not sit in the body the way a quirk factor sat, offered his power no purchase whatsoever. He might as well have reached out to steal the color blue, or the concept of Tuesday. It was power without a quirk beneath it, and all for one, who had organized his entire understanding of reality around the axiom that all power was, at root, a thing that could be taken, sat in his chair in the dark, and confronted a fact that his philosophy could not hold. There was strength in this world that did not answer to him, that had never answered to him, that had been sitting in the ground beneath his feet the whole time, older than quirks, older than the singularity, and it did not care that he was the strongest man alive, because its strength came from a place his hand could not reach. A lesser man would have raged. All for one did the thing that made him what he was. He became curious, and then he became afraid, and then he began to plan, all 3 at once, and none of them showing on his ruined face. Because if this power could not be taken, then the entire order of the world, the order he sat at the top of, the order in which he was the final answer, was not the whole of things. There was a second board, and pieces were moving on it, and he had not known the game existed until this week. He considered his options with the patience of a man who had waited out 3 generations of heroes. He would not confront this thing directly. He confronted nothing directly if he could help it, and a power he could not steal offered him no reason to change the habit. But he would watch. He would learn its shape, its wants, its weaknesses. He would find out whether it could be bargained with, or turned, or fed a rival to keep it busy. And above all, he would learn the answer to the one question that mattered to a man who took things. If I cannot take it, can I take from those who wield it? The ratmen died like anything else. The commission had corpses. The green power did not defend its bearers from a knife. Perhaps there was nothing here for him to steal, but there might yet be a great deal here for him to use, if he could only learn which lever moved the tide. He dispatched a single agent, one of his most disposable, most deniable, with instructions to make contact with the underground powers, if contact could be made, and to observe if it could not, and to report either way. And then, all for one, sat back in the dark and did something he had not done in years. He waited to be surprised. Far below, feeling nothing of the ancient patient malice now turning its attention toward him, gray Seer Thanquol drew a fresh pinch of warpstone snuff and schemed about subway tunnels, and the 2 most dangerous minds beneath Japan began, without either yet knowing it, to circle one another in the dark. The commission understood it had a plague before the public did, and used every hour of that head start, and it was not enough. The sickness moved the way the water moved, outward from the treatment plant, into 400,000 homes, invisible and patient. It began as fever and a cough, and the particular green tinge to the sputum that the first emergency room doctors mistook for a novel influenza, until the corrosion analysis team recognized the signature, and the whole thing went from mystery to catastrophe in the space of a single memo. The pathogen was not natural. It was engineered, Crude, brutal, brilliant engineering, a disease bred in the warrens of Clan Pestilence over a span of time no human epidemiologist wanted to contemplate, tuned to spread fast and kill slowly, and terrify most of all. It did not respond to standard antivirals. It carried the same anomalous signature as the green residue, which meant the body's own defenses, and the medicines built to help them, were fighting something that did not obey the rules those defenses had evolved against. Heroes, it turned out, were nearly useless against it. This was the wound it opened in Hero Society's confidence, deeper than any single battle. A hero with a healing quirk could mend a wound, could even, in the rarest cases, purge a poison. But healing quirks worked by accelerating and directing the body's own processes, and the body did not know how to fight this, and so the quirks amplified a losing battle. Recovery Girl herself, brought in under the highest priority, worked until she collapsed and saved individual lives, and could not touch the spread, because you cannot quirk your way out of an epidemic. You need water engineers and epidemiologists, and a supply chain and time, and the enemy was actively poisoning the first and stealing the last. The Commission did the competent, invisible, unglamorous work that Hero Society was not built to celebrate. It shut down the water system. It trucked in supply. It quarantined districts and traced contacts and stood up field hospitals. And it did all of this while 40 of the strongest people in Japan stood around feeling their strength curdle into uselessness, because there was nothing to punch. Endeavor could burn a rat ogre to ash, and could not burn a fever. Mirko could go down a hole and kill 100 Skaven, and could not unpoison a reservoir. The war had found the exact soft place in Hero Society's armor. It had made the heroes irrelevant to the thing that was actually killing people, and it had done so on purpose. Because the mind behind it understood, as All for One understood, as Aizawa understood, that the hero's true weapon was not their strength but the public's belief in their strength, and nothing corrodes belief like a strong man standing helpless beside a sickbed. The president stood in the situation room at 04 o'clock and read the projected casualty figures, and did not let her face move, and made the decision that would define the middle of the war. Holding the surface was not a strategy. Eraserhead had been right about that in front of 40 witnesses. But the alternative, sending heroes down, into the tunnels, into the dark and the numbers and the poison, was, by every projection her cell could build, a way to feed her best people into a grinder that would eat them. She chose the grinder, not blindly. She chose to build the capacity to fight below, to draft the doctrine Hero Society had never needed, to develop the gear, the tactics, the small hard teams that could operate in the dark against numbers, and to find, before she spent a single hero's life on it, the one thing that would make the sacrifice mean something, the source. Eraserhead's water, coming from somewhere. She had felt it in his voice at noon, and she believed it now. Somewhere beneath her city there was a reason all of this was happening, a thing the enemy was building or protecting or serving, and if Hero Society could find it and break it, then the tide had a heart, and a heart could be stopped. She gave Eraserhead everything he asked for, which was not much. A mole quirk pro, 2 heroes whose power worked on stone and flesh rather than on quirks. Mirko because Mirko fought the way the enemy did, and time to plan. And she gave him one instruction, quiet and absolute, in a room emptied of everyone else. Find me what they're protecting, she said, not what they're attacking, what they're afraid of us finding. Every army has a thing it will die to keep hidden. Find theirs, and I'll give you the symbol of peace to break it. Once, while he still has the strength for once. Don't waste him on a tunnel. Find me the heart. Aizawa, who did not want to go back into the dark and was going back into the dark anyway, inclined his head. He had seen the horned thing's face when the bedrock groaned, the naked terror of a creature afraid of the thing it served. Every army has a thing it will die to keep hidden. He had already glimpsed the edge of it. He just did not yet know its name, or that it was a wound in the world being pried wider by the hour, or that on the far side of it something the size of a god was beginning, slowly, to lean forward and look through. Down in the widening dark, the clan Scryer engineers fed another ton of warpstone into the ritual engine, and the rift breathed out a gust of green that guttered every lamp in the warren. And for one instant, the assembled Skaven felt the full weight of the attention on the far side, and every rat in the Under Empire, from the mightiest warlord to the meanest slave, cringed low against the filth-caked stone in the presence of their god. Thanquol cringed lowest of all, because Thanquol understood best of all what was coming, and Thanquol's clever, cowardly, brilliant mind was already, even now, mapping the exits. Mirko went down the hole first, because of course she did, and what happened in the next 11 minutes rewrote every assumption Hero Society had made about how this war would be fought. The plan had been reconnaissance. Aizawa's plan, careful and cold. A small team, deep insertion, map the warren toward whatever the enemy was protecting, avoid contact, come back with the shape of the thing. Mirko had agreed to this plan out loud, and had privately understood it to mean go down the hole and see what happens, because Rumi Usagiyama had never in her life gathered intelligence when she could gather trophies instead. And 11 minutes into a silent descent through a side tunnel off the Akoda breach, a Clan Eshin sentry made the single greatest mistake of its short and vicious life, which was to be seen by her. She did not signal. She did not fall back. The rabbit hero coiled the terrible muscle of her legs and detonated forward down the tunnel, and took the sentry's head off with a kick that cracked the stone behind it. And then she was among them, and the dark came alive. This was the thing the Skaven had not accounted for, and it was the thing Aizawa had suspected and the Commission had gambled on, that somewhere in Hero Society's ranks were fighters who did not need honor, or daylight, or a front line, or a quirk to negate, fighters who simply broke things, faster and harder than the things could break back. Mirko was the purest of them. Her quirk was her body, and her body in that tunnel was a weapon the Skaven had no answer for, because everything they knew about killing surface things assumed the surface things fought like soldiers, in lines, in the open, protecting one another, breakable through fear. Mirko fought like a predator, alone, in the dark, unafraid, and she went through the sentry warren, like a wolf through a henhouse. Warp fire washed over her, and she was already elsewhere. Jezzails cracked and hit the space she'd left. A knot of storm vermin braced their halberds into a wall of blades, and she went over it, off the ceiling, and came down behind them, and turned the wall of blades into a heap of parts. For 11 minutes, the Under-Empire learned to fear a name, and the name was Mirko. And then the numbers did what numbers do. Because the other thing Aizawa had suspected, and the thing Mirko's glory could not change, was that no single fighter, however magnificent, defeats a tide by being magnificent at it. She killed dozens. She killed dozens more. And for every ratman she broke, the warren disgorged 10. And they did not need to beat her. They needed only to slow her, to press, to fill the tunnel wall to wall with bodies she had to cut through, to trade 100 slaves for one bruise, to bleed her strength a warp bolt scorch and a poisoned nick at a time. The Skaven had been fighting outnumbered wars from the winning side for longer than humanity had recorded its history. They knew, in their marrow, the one lesson the surface heroes were only now beginning to learn. You do not have to be stronger than the hero. You have to be more than the hero, and be willing to spend it. Aizawa pulled her out. That was his role in the end, and the reason a tired man with a useless quirk had been made to lead fighters who outclassed him 100-fold. Not to win the fight, but to end it before it won them. He'd fed a lifeline of climbing cable down after her, and when he felt the tunnel ahead of her fill with a density his mole quirk teammate read as 1,000 and rising, he made the call over the throat mic in the flat voice that brooked no argument, and Mirko, bloodied, exhilarated, furious, obeyed it, because underneath the swagger, she was a professional, and because Eraserhead had earned in one night the authority to tell the number 5 hero when a fight was already lost. She came back up the cable with a rat ogre's blade a handspan behind her, and a grin on her face, and a report that was worth more than all the trophies she'd left below. "They're not defending the tunnels," she said, still breathing hard, blood not her own, drying on her arm. "I've fought things defending ground. This wasn't that. They threw bodies to slow me down and fall back, back and down, toward something. There's a direction to them, Eraser. West and deep. Everything's leaning west and deep, like water down a drain. Whatever your boss wants me to find." She jerked her chin at the dark. "It's that way, and they'll spend every rat in that hole to keep us off it." Aizawa looked west and down into the black and felt the deep grinding hum in the soles of his feet. the sound he'd first felt surfacing through a storm drain 3 days and a lifetime ago, and understood that Mirko had just done in 11 violent minutes what his careful plan might have taken a week to learn. The tide had a direction. The direction had a heart, and the heart was guarded by a willingness to die that no hero society doctrine had a countermeasure for. He keyed the president's private channel. "We found the drain," he said, "west and deep, under the old industrial ward. They'll bleed their whole army to keep us off it, which means it's the thing. I don't have the force to punch through. Nobody does, not through numbers like that." He paused, and said the sentence he'd been dreading since a small woman with gray in her hair had promised him one throw of the symbol of peace. "When the time comes, it's going to have to be him, once, all the way to the heart, and there won't be a second try." There was a silence on the line, and then the president's voice, precise and cold and, for just a moment, human. "Then you'll get him there," she said, "alive, and with something left. That's the mission now, Eraserhead, not the source. Getting the symbol to the source, with power still in him. Everything else is a diversion, including the diversions that get people killed. Can you do it?" Aizawa looked at the dark and thought about a golden man who smiled through a wound that was killing him, and about the 11 minutes of glory that had cost the Skaven nothing they couldn't replace by morning, and about the numberless seething that Burrow had felt and refused to count. "I can get him there," he said. "Keeping him alive after is somebody else's job." The diversions that got people killed began the next day, and they worked, which was the terrible thing about them. The Commission's new doctrine, hammered out in 36 sleepless hours by a crisis cell that had never trained for anything like this, accepted a truth that hero society had spent a century pretending away, that not every life could be saved, and that the attempt to save every life was itself a weapon the enemy could use. The Skaven understood this about the heroes better than the heroes understood it about themselves. They surfaced in a school, and the heroes came, because heroes come, and while the heroes poured into the school to save the children, and they did save the children, that was never in question, a second force came up 4 blocks away, unopposed, and did the quiet work of poisoning a cistern, because every hero in the district was busy being heroic at the decoy. Hawk saw it first. Of course he did. He stood on a rooftop watching the school evacuation go beautifully. Textbook. Children streaming out in the arms of pros. Cameras catching the symbol-less but still reassuring spectacle of hero society, doing the thing it was built to do. And he felt the wrongness of it in the base of his skull, the specific wrongness of being allowed to win. He peeled off from the celebration and flew a lazy widening spiral, and found the second force at the cistern, and killed most of it, and was too late for the cistern, and stood over the fouled water understanding, with perfect clarity, the shape of the war they were in. He reported it up in his easy, hooded way, and the Commission listened, because Hawks was the Commission's own creature and they trusted his read the way they trusted no hero raised outside their hand. "They're using our virtue against us," he told them, in effect. "Every save is a distraction they bought. We can't stop saving people. The second we do, we're not heroes and the public knows it, and we've lost the only weapon that actually matters. But we have to understand that when they show us a thing to save, they're showing it to us on purpose, and the real move is somewhere we're not looking." It was the most sophisticated strategic reading anyone in hero society had produced in the whole war, and it curdled in the room as it landed, because its logical end was a thing no hero wanted to say. Sometimes you have to let the visible victims wait, and go looking for the invisible ones instead. Endeavor refused it outright. The Flame Hero had spent 3 days growing more furious as the war taught him, over and over, that being the strongest did not matter, and he responded to the lesson the way he responded to everything, by getting stronger and hitting harder and insisting, with his whole scarred soul, that the problem was simply that not enough force had yet been applied. He took his agency into the tunnels against the Commission's advice and burned a warrant to slag, and killed Skaven in numbers that would have ended any surface war 3 times over, and came up filthy and triumphant, and having accomplished, in strategic terms, precisely nothing, because the tide flowed around the burned ground the way water flows around a stone. He did not understand yet. He would. The understanding, when it came, would be one of the hardest things that ever happened to him, harder than any burn, the day the strongest man in the room learned that his strength was not the answer, had never been the whole answer, and that the war would be won, if it was won at all, by a tired man with a useless quirk, and a dying man with one throw left in him, and not by fire. Beneath all of it, west and deep, Thanquol felt the pressure the humans were putting on its warrens, and made a decision that was pure gray Seer. It decided that the failures were someone else's fault, and it decided to say so loudly, and it summoned Warlord Critch to explain why Rictus warriors were dying in job lots to hold tunnels against a single white-furred she-thing who kept getting away. Critch came, and cringed, and agreed, and seethed, and left with his private standard of grievances one entry longer, and passed, in the dark of the outer warren, a black-shrouded shape that was not there, which watched the warlord's fury and the seer's blame, with the flat, patient attention of Clan Eshin, and understood, as its distant masters had suspected, that this great conquest was held together by nothing but Thanquol's terror of the horned rat and the horde's terror of Thanquol, and that both of those terrors were fraying, and that when they gave way, as Skaven terrors always eventually gave way, the whole magnificent invasion would begin to eat itself from the inside, exactly as everything the Skaven had ever built had always, in the end, eaten itself from the inside. The assassin made its notes. It was patient. It could wait for the treachery. Treachery, in the Under Empire, was the one resource that never ran short. The knives came for the top of hero society on the 9th night, and the first anyone knew of it was that Best Jeanist did not answer his phone. Clan Eshin did not fight the way the rest of the Under Empire fought. While Critch's storm vermin, and Scryer's warp teams, and Pestilenz's plague priests waged their teeming war of numbers and poison in the tunnels below, the assassins of Eshin waged a different war entirely, a quiet one, upward, into the light, against the specific individuals whose deaths would do the most damage. They had studied the surface things for exactly as long as it took, which was not long, because Eshin studied prey for a living, and Hero Society advertised its most important people on the sides of buildings. The rankings were public, the agencies were public. The heroes' faces, schedules, patrol routes, and merchandise were public. To a clan that had spent millennia perfecting the art of murdering the well-guarded in the dark, the number 4 hero of Japan might as well have mailed them his address, which, in the form of a billboard, he essentially had. Best Jeanist survived, barely, and only because the thing that came through his agency's ventilation at 02 o'clock was built to kill a man in his sleep, and Best Jeanist did not sleep that night, and because his quirk let him weaponize every thread in the room the instant the darkness moved wrong. He fought a shadow that fought back with weeping blades, and a speed that made his fiber control feel slow, and he lived, and he called it in with a punctured lung and the understanding, spreading now through the top ranks like the plague spread through the water mains, that the war had reached up out of the ground and taken their names. The Commission's response was immediate and, for the first time, genuinely afraid, not of losing a battle. They had been losing battles for 9 days, afraid of decapitation. Because Hero Society was not, in truth, an army. It was a collection of extraordinary individuals, held together by celebrity and licensing, and the towering example of a single symbol. And if you began removing the individuals at the top, Best Jeanist, Hawks, Endeavor, Mirko, the Big Three, and above all the aging golden man whose mere existence held the public's fear at bay, then the thing that broke was not a battle line. It was the belief. And the belief was the only weapon that had ever really worked. They tried to protect the top ranks and discovered that they could not really, not against this. You cannot guard a person against Eshin by putting more people around them. More people is more darkness for the assassin to be, more shadows to come through, more throats between the target and the exit. The heroes whose quirks worked on quirks were useless here, because there was nothing to erase and nothing to steal. The ones who survived the coming nights survived because their power happened to work on things. Best Jeanist's threads, Mirko's reflexes, Hawks's feathers filling the air of his safe house like a living alarm, and not because anyone protected them. And then, on the 11th night, they caught one. It was Aizawa who caught it, which was its own bitter joke, because Aizawa's quirk was worthless against these things and everyone knew it. He caught it anyway. Because Aizawa had spent his whole career being the answer to enemies who thought their power made them special, and an Eshin assassin, for all its terrible skill, was in the end a thing that came through the dark toward a target, and Aizawa had spent 11 days thinking about exactly that. He did not try to erase it. He set a trap for a predator, himself as the bait, a fluorescent flooded room with nowhere to be shadow, capture weapon strung through the ductwork like a spider's silk, present mic on a rooftop across the street with a directional quirk aimed at a window, and when the assassin came for the tired, unguarded hero who had made himself look like the easiest kill on the board, the room lit like a surgical theater, and a wall of sound hit it broadside, and the capture weapon took it around the throat before it could become nothing again. They held it in a sealed white cell, and they learned things from it, or rather they learned things around it, because the assassin told them nothing. Eshin did not break, and the thing spat and hissed and died on its own poison rather than speak, but its very existence, examined by the Commission's best, told a story. Its gear told a story, its wounds, old and layered, told a story, and most of all, the reason it had been sent up to murder the surface's champions told a story. Once Aizawa and the president sat in a room and thought about it the way you think about an enemy who does everything for a reason. They didn't send this to win the war, Aizawa said, staring at the corpse through the glass. Killing our top 10 doesn't take the city. It doesn't hold ground. It doesn't feed the plague. It's not strategic, not for taking Musutafu. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned over everything, slow and complete. It's strategic for something else. It's strategic if what you're actually doing down there is on a clock, and you need the surface's strongest people dead or distracted for a specific window. You don't decapitate an enemy you're planning to grind down slowly. You decapitate an enemy you're planning to beat all at once, soon, and you don't want their champion standing when it happens. The president was very still. You're saying the tunnels aren't the war. I'm saying the tunnels are the distraction, and they're a real distraction. Real people are really dying in them, but they're buying time for the West and Deep thing. And now someone down there is spending Eshin, which even I can tell is expensive. You don't throw assassins like this around for nothing, to make sure that when their clock runs out, All Might and the top 10 are either dead or too scattered to reach whatever's at the bottom of that drain. He looked at her. They're not afraid we'll win the surface war. They know we can't. They're afraid we'll figure out the surface war doesn't matter and put the symbol of peace at the heart before their clock runs out. This, he nodded at the dead assassin, is them trying to make sure he isn't standing when it does. Which meant, the president understood, that the clock was the whole war. Everything else, the plague, the breaches, the teeming dark, Mirko's glory and Endeavor's fury and the children pulled from the school, all of it was the noise around a single silent countdown, West and Deep. And Hero Society's actual task was not to win 100 battles it could not win, but to reach the heart before the count ran out, with a dying man still strong enough to break it. How long, she said. The clock. How long do we have? I don't know, Aizawa said. But they escalated to Eshin, and you escalate when you're close to done, not when you've got months. My read? He looked at the dark beyond the window, West and Deep. Days, not weeks. We're running out of time and we don't know how much of it we ever had. The Horde was running out of time too, though in the manner of Skaven, it was running out of time chiefly because it could not stop trying to murder itself. Warlord Critch had reached the end of his patience, which in a storm vermin of Clan Rictus was never a long road. 9 days of dying in tunnels to hold ground the Grey Seer would not let him abandon. 9 days of watching Rictus warriors spent like dirty tokens to slow a single white sheathing. 9 days of Thanquol's blame heaped on his scarred shoulders in front of the whole assembled warren. It had all convinced Critch of the thing that every Skaven warlord in history had eventually convinced itself of, which was that the coward seer above him was the only thing standing between Critch and the greatness Critch so obviously deserved. He began, in the careful way of under-empire ambition, to prepare, a quiet word to certain claw leaders whose loyalty could be purchased, a private cache of warpstone laid aside, a plan, half-formed and wholly murderous, to be enacted at the moment of victory, to let Thanquol win the city, and then take the city from Thanquol, and mount the Grey Seer's horned skull on the standard of Clan Rictus where it belonged. Thanquol knew. Of course Thanquol knew. Thanquol had survived to a ripe and unnatural age precisely by assuming that every single creature in the Under Empire wanted it dead, which was not paranoia, because it was true, and its clouded eye missed very little where its own survival was concerned. It watched Critch's little preparations with the weary contempt of a gray seer, who had seen this play performed by 100 warlords and buried every one of them, and it made its own preparations in turn, a word to Clan Eshin's paymasters, whose assassin still lurked unseen in the warren, a private understanding with the scryer engineers, whose warp machinery could be turned inward as easily as outward, a plan to let Critch make his move, and then be seen making it, at the worst possible moment, so that Thanquol could destroy him publicly, and blame every failure of the invasion on the traitor's treachery all at once. The two most powerful figures in the Under Empire's surface army thus spent the critical days of the war, each preparing to murder the other, each certain the other was the true obstacle to victory, each pouring cunning and warpstone and attention into an internal war that the humans, had they known of it, would have wept with relief to learn about, because it was the one weakness in the Horde that no hero's fist could have created, and the Skaven were creating it themselves, freely, out of the bottomless well of their own nature. And in the shadows, the Eshin assassin, a second one, sent up quietly to replace the fool that had gotten itself captured murdering the scarf hero it should have left alone, watched both plots ripen, and reported both to masters who served neither Critch nor Thanquol, nor even the invasion itself, but only the eternal interest of Clan Eshin, which was to be on the winning side of whatever the Under Empire's endless treachery produced next. Above them all, felt by every rat and dismissed by none, the widening rift breathed its slow green breath, and the attention behind it leaned closer, and the horned rat, who fed on precisely this, on schemes and knives and the beautiful self-devouring ambition of its children, found the whole squirming spectacle beneath Musutafu very much to its liking, and drew by degrees nearer. The clock ran on, neither side knew the true count. Only the god, watching, knew how little time was left, and the god was not telling, because the god was enjoying itself, and a thing that enjoys itself is in no hurry at all. The industrial ward fell in 90 minutes, and it fell because Thanquol finally understood that the humans had found the drain, and decided to make them pay for it in the one currency hero society could not afford to spend. The Grey Seer's spies, the rats in the walls, the vermin in the ductwork, the 1,000 small eyes the Under Empire kept on everything, had brought it the news it feared most. The surface things were massing toward the west and deep, not blundering into tunnels anymore, not fighting decoys, but converging, deliberately, on the old industrial ward that sat like a scab over the deepest, most direct route to the ritual engine and the widening rift. They had found the heart. They had understood. And Thanquol, whose entire strategy had depended on the humans wasting themselves on the surface until the clock ran out, felt the whole edifice of its scheming lurch, and did what Skaven do when a plan begins to fail, which was to reach for a bigger, louder, more catastrophic plan, and hope its scale would drown the failure. It sent up the doom wheel. The thing came out of the ground at the heart of the industrial ward like a nightmare given wheels, a vast rolling cage of blackened iron and crackling warp lightning, taller than the shuttered factories around it, driven by a shrieking warlock engineer of Clan Scryer, who was bonded to the machine in ways that had left nothing human, or even sane, behind the wheel. Arcs of green lightning leapt from it to every metal surface in reach. Where it rolled, the asphalt buckled and the streetlights exploded, and the air itself took on the electric stink of the warpstone that fed it. And it did not come alone. It came at the head of a breakout, the largest single surfacing of the war, thousands of Skaven boiling up out of a dozen breaches at once, not to raid and withdraw this time, but to hold, to seize the industrial ward and turn it into a fortress of teeth over the throat of the tunnel the humans wanted, so that any hero who tried to reach the heart would have to come through the Horde to do it. It was the worst possible ground for hero society to fight on, and the Skaven had chosen it precisely because it was. The industrial ward was not empty. That was the trap inside the trap. It was a working district. Warehouses with night shifts, a rail yard with crews, a cluster of old worker housing that the city had never gotten around to clearing, families asleep 3 blocks from where the doom wheel came up. When the breakout began, there were perhaps 4,000 civilians inside the cordon the Skaven were drawing, and the Horde knew it, and the Horde did not care about them except as leverage, which was worse than caring, because it made them useful. Every civilian in that ward was a hostage the Skaven had not bothered to take, a life the heroes would feel obligated to save, a thread of hero society virtue the enemy could pull to unravel the whole assault. And so the heroes arrived to the worst choice the war had yet offered them, and it was the choice Aizawa had named to a room of 40 on the first day, and that hero society had spent a century pretending it would never have to make. They could save the ward, or they could take the drain. They could not do both. The math was brutal, and Hawks did it in the air in the first 90 seconds, because that was what Hawks was for. He flew the perimeter once, fast, high, feathers scattering to 100 vantages, and he assembled the whole terrible picture the way he assembled everything, instantly, coldly, completely. 4,000 civilians inside a closing ring of horde, a doom wheel anchoring a fortress line across the only direct route down, the full weight of the surface's assembled heroes. Endeavor, Mirko, Best Jeanist barely healed, the big three, 100 pros, massing at the cordon's edge. And beneath all of it, felt in the tremor of the ground, the drain, west and deep, the throat of the tunnel to the heart, open right now, because the horde had committed everything to the breakout, and stripped its inner warrens to do it. The path to the ritual engine had never been clearer. It would never be this clear again. The Skaven had opened the door to their own heart in order to slam a different door in the heroes' faces, and they had gambled. Correctly, they believed, that hero society could not walk through the open door while 4,000 people screamed behind the closing one. Hawks understood, hovering over the burning ward, that this was the clock. This was what the Eshin knives had been buying. The horde had thrown its whole hand onto the table to force this exact choice, at this exact moment, because the moment the heroes turned to save the ward was the moment the clock beneath them ran out unopposed. And he understood, with the specific sick clarity that had made him the Commission's favorite and its loneliest creature, that the correct move, the cold, strategic, war-winning move, was to let the ward burn, to take the open path now, drive the symbol of peace to the heart while it lay bare, break the ritual before the clock struck, and accept 4,000 dead as the price of a war won, instead of a war lost with the dead uncounted. He knew it was correct. He also knew that if hero society made that choice, if it stood at the edge of a burning district full of screaming families and walked away to win the larger war, then it would have won the war and lost the only thing that had ever made it worth winning, because the public would learn what the heroes had chosen, and the belief would die, and a hero society that lets 4,000 people burn for strategy is not a hero society at all. It is just an army that happens to have costumes. The Skaven had not only trapped their bodies, they had trapped their souls, forced them onto the exact horns of the dilemma the whole war had been circling, save or win. And they had bet the invasion on the belief that the heroes would save, because saving was what heroes were for, and in choosing to save, they would lose. Hawks put it to the president over the command channel in 11 flat words, hovering in the smoke. We can save the ward or take the drain, not both. Choose. And the president, who had promised Aizawa she would spend the symbol of peace on the heart and not on a tunnel, who had built the entire back half of the war around reaching that heart with power still in it, who understood better than anyone alive what walking away from the ward would cost, and what failing to reach the heart would cost worse, sat in her situation room with the whole war balanced on her tongue, and did the thing that made her what she was. She refused the choice. Both, she said. We do both. Split them. It should not have worked. By every projection, by every cold calculation Hawks had done in the air, it was the wrong call, dividing an already outmatched force in the face of overwhelming numbers, trying to save everyone and win everything, the exact fatal generosity the Skaven had built the trap to punish. It worked because of who they were, and because the president understood the one thing the Skaven, for all their ancient cunning, had never been able to understand about the surface things, because it was the one thing the Under-Empire did not contain, that some creatures fight harder for being asked to do the impossible, not despite the cost, but because of it. She split them by nature, the savers, and the spear. To the ward went the rescuers, the heroes whose souls could not have done anything else, and whose quirks were built for it. Endeavor, at last, found his war. The flame hero had spent the whole conflict learning the agony of being the strongest against an enemy that made strength irrelevant, and here, finally, was a fight that raw, overwhelming power could win. Not the strategic fight, not the war, but this street, these people, this wall of horde between 4,000 civilians and the open air. He burned a corridor through the breakout with a fury that had 9 days of impotence behind it, and the rescue heroes poured through it, and for once in this war, the strongest man in Japan was exactly the man the moment needed, and he knew it. And something in him that had been curdling for 9 days finally, terribly, broke open, because he understood. Holding a line of hellfire so that best genist's threads could pull families out through the smoke, that his strength had never been the answer to the war, and that it was, right now, the only answer to this, and that both of those things were true at once, and that this was what it had always actually meant to be a hero, not the strongest. The one who stands in the fire so someone else can carry the child out. And to the drain went the spear, Aizawa, Mirko, and the symbol of peace. They went down while the ward burned above them, and Endeavor held the horde's whole weight at the surface. And they went down the open throat of the tunnel the Skaven had stripped bare, to feed the breakout. West and deep, toward the heart, Mirko clearing the path with the savagery that was the only thing the dark respected. Aizawa navigating by the mole quirk map and the deep grinding hum growing louder in the stone, and behind them, walking into the dark on borrowed hours, the golden man with one throw left in him. All Might had insisted. The commission had wanted to keep him at the surface, a symbol where the cameras and the public and the failing belief could see him. He had refused, in his own gentle and immovable way, because Toshinori Yagi had understood since the empty platform on the first night that this was not a war his symbol could win by being seen. It was a war that would be won, if at all, in the dark, at the heart, by a punch nobody would film, the last full punch of a dying man, thrown at a thing no hero registry had a name for, 40 meters beneath a city, that would never know how close it came. He walked into the black behind Mirko's carnage, one hand pressed to the old wound in his side, and he did not smile, because there was no one to reassure but himself, and he was not, tonight, in the business of comfortable lies. He had perhaps 1 United States of smash left in him before the smoke took the symbol, and left only the skeleton. One, he would have to spend it perfectly, at the heart, at the exact moment the mole quirk hero said here, and he would have to reach that moment alive, through a warren the Skaven were even now realizing had been left open, through a horde that would turn the instant Thanquol understood the spear was in the wound. Far below, at the ritual engine, in the green light of the widening rift, Grey Seer Thanquol felt the thing it had spent the entire war dreading, the tremor of a symbol of peace descending, past its outer warrens, into the deep, toward the heart, while Warlord Critch was 3 warrens away preparing to betray it, and half the horde was committed to a breakout on the surface, and the horned rat's eye was very, very close now behind the green. Thanquol did the only thing Thanquol had ever truly been good at. It began, very seriously, to plan its escape. The heart of the Under-Empire beneath Musutafu was a cathedral of blasphemy, and the symbol of peace walked into it, with smoke already curling at the edges of his golden form. They came out of the last tunnel onto a ledge above it, the 3 of them, and even Mirko stopped. Even Mirko, who had gone down the hole grinning, who feared nothing that walked, who had made the Under-Empire learn her name, stood on that ledge and looked down and went silent, because there are sights the body understands before the mind can, and this was one of them. The chamber was vast beyond the scale of anything humans built to be seen, a cavern gnawed out of the deep bedrock over a span of time that made the city above feel like a thing that had happened yesterday, and at its center hung the rift. It was not a hole. Aizawa had expected a hole, a rip, an opening, something with an edge. It was a wound, a place where the world had been torn and had not healed, and was being actively, deliberately, kept from healing. A suspended tier of green light perhaps 30 meters across, its edges crawling with an energy that hurt to look at, and around it, feeding it, the ritual engine, a monstrous circular apparatus of iron and brass and raw warpstone. 13 great conductor spires ringing the wound, each one crackling with the sick green fire, tended by a crew of scryer engineers, who had long since stopped being anything a human would recognize. The engine was not holding the rift closed. Aizawa saw that at once, and it turned his stomach. The engine was holding it open, and widening it, spire by spire, ton of warpstone by ton of warpstone, prying the wound in the world ever further apart. And through the wound, on the far side, something moved. That was the thing that broke the professional calm Aizawa had kept for 11 days. Not the engine, not the scale, not the seething thousands he could feel in the surrounding warrens. It was the sense, undeniable, bodily, wrong at a level beneath thought, that the green tier was not a window onto empty space, but onto a place, and that the place was inhabited, and that what inhabited it was aware of him. Something on the far side of the wound had a size he could not process, and an attention he could feel land on him like a physical weight, cold and vast and ancient and amused. And for one moment Shota Aizawa, who had stared down villains who thought themselves gods, understood the difference between a villain who thinks himself a god and an actual god. And the difference was that the actual god was not trying to convince anyone. It simply was, and it was looking at him, and it found him small. "That's the heart," he said, and his voice came out rough. "That's it. They're not opening a door for reinforcements. They're opening a door for—" He couldn't finish it. There wasn't a word. "For that. And when it's wide enough, that thing comes through, and this stops being a war and starts being an ending." All Might looked at the wound in the world, and at the thing beyond it, and the symbol of peace understood, at last and completely, what he had been brought here to do. Not to win a battle, not to save a district, to throw one punch at the machinery holding a wound open, and collapse it, and let the world heal itself before the thing on the far side finished coming through. One punch, everything he had left. And he understood too, looking at the crackling engine and the 13 spires and the seething warrens all around, that he was not going to get to that punch cleanly, because between him and the engine were the guardians of the heart, and because the gray Seer, the horned mind that had orchestrated all of it, was down there at the engine's base, and it had felt him coming, and it was not going to let the symbol of peace simply walk up and end its god's great work. Thanquol was not, however, going to fight him either. The gray Seer had felt the symbol descend, and Thanquol's mind, that brilliant, cowardly, warpstone-fevered engine of self-preservation, had spent the descent doing the thing it did best, which was calculating angles of survival with a speed and clarity that would have shamed any hero society strategist. The golden thing was here for the engine, obvious. The golden thing was terribly strong, also obvious. Thanquol had felt its approach shiver the ceiling of the world on the first night, and had wisely fled it then, and nothing about it had grown less frightening since. And the golden thing had come down, into the deep, away from the surface, which meant the surface breakout no longer mattered, which meant Warlord Critch's whole treacherous army was committed uselessly to a diversion 3 warrens away, which meant, and here Thanquol's clouded eye actually gleamed, that if things went badly at the heart, there was no one nearby to witness whose fault it was, and a gray Seer with a good head start and a private tunnel could be very far away indeed before anyone thought to assign blame. But things did not have to go badly. That was the other calculation, the ambitious one that warred forever with the cowardly one, and made Thanquol so much more dangerous than a simple coward. Because the engine did not need Thanquol to fight the golden thing. It needed only to keep working a little longer. The rift was nearly wide enough. Thanquol could feel it, could feel the horned rat's eye pressing against the thinning membrane of the world. Close, so close, moments from breaking through. If the engine ran even a little longer, the thing beyond would come through, and then it would not matter how strong the golden man thing was, because you do not punch a god back into its own realm. All Thanquol had to do was buy time, and buying time, with the lives of others, at no cost to itself, was the single activity Gray Seer Thanquol had been perfected by 10,000 years of Skaven evolution to excel at. So it did not fight. It spent. It threw the guardians of the heart at the symbol of peace, the elite of the Deep Warren, the plague priests and the warp teams, and the last 2 rat ogres held in reserve, not to kill him, because it did not believe they could, but to slow him, to clog the chamber between him and the engine with bodies and warp fire and poison and screaming, to buy the engine 10 more seconds, 20, 30, however many the horned rat needed to finish leaning through the wound. And it screeched at the scryer engineers to push, to overload the spires, to widen the rift faster whatever the cost to the machinery or themselves. Because a gray seer that delivers a world to its god is forgiven every past failure, and Thanquol had a great many past failures to be forgiven, and this was the moment that erased them all. The chamber erupted. What happened in the next 90 seconds, Mirko would spend the rest of her life unable to fully describe, because it happened at the intersection of two things. Human language was not built to hold at once. Transcendent heroism, and a horror so large it made heroism feel like a candle held up against the night. The Guardians came and Mirko met them, because that was the arrangement. She was the path. She was the tip of the spear. Her job was to carve a road to the engine through whatever the heart threw up, and she did it with everything she had. She fought the way she had fought in the Sentry Warren, but more, past exhaustion, past sense, because this was not a raid to withdraw from. This was the only fight that would ever matter, and she knew it. She took a rat ogre's blade across her side and kept moving. She took warp fire and kept moving. She cleared a road to the engine's base through a density of enemies that should have buried her, and she did it in seconds that felt like hours, and she did it for him, so that the golden man walking behind her would reach the spot the mole quirk map had marked with power still in him, and Aizawa, who could not fight these things, made himself useful the only way he could, which was to see, to read the chamber, to call the path, to keep the symbol's one irreplaceable body alive through the chaos with nothing but his eyes and his voice and 11 days of understanding, an enemy no one else had bothered to understand. And then the rift screamed and widened, and the thing on the far side put something through it. Not itself, not yet. Thanquol's engine had not quite finished its terrible work, and for that mercy the world would never know how grateful it should be, but a piece of it. A herald, a limb, an extrusion of the god's attention-given shape, a thing of green fire and endless teeth, and a wrongness that made the rat ogres look like house pets, that came partway through the wound and reached into the chamber and unmade a swathe of Skaven and stone and air with the casual indifference of a hand brushing crumbs from a table, because to the thing beyond the wound, there was no difference between its own worshippers and its enemies. There was only the world it was hungry for, and everything in that world was food. That was the moment All Might understood he had run out of time. The engine was still running, the rift was still widening, and now a piece of the god itself was through, and every second he waited it would come further, and there would be no punch large enough for what came after the god arrived. It had to be now, not at the perfect marked spot, not with the path fully clear. Now, through the last of the Guardians, past the herald's unmaking reach, at the base of the engine where the 13 spires met. Now, while there was still a wound to close, instead of a god to fight. He looked at Mirko, bleeding and unbowed, holding the road open with the last of herself. He looked at Aizawa, whose eyes had gotten him here, whose voice had kept him alive, a tired man with a useless quirk, who had understood the whole war before anyone else, and had never once been thanked for it. He looked at the green wound in the world, and the amused vast attention behind it, and Toshinori Yagi, the ninth holder of One for All, the symbol of peace, a dying man on the last of his borrowed hours, smiled. Finally, one real smile, not for any camera, and not for any public, and not to reassure anyone at all, but because a man ought to smile at least once, before the largest thing he will ever do. He drew back his fist. The golden light of One for All flooded down his arm, brighter than it had been in years, brighter than his failing body should have been able to hold, everything he had left, and then everything he did not have, and was spending anyway, all of it, all at once, the whole inheritance of every holder who had ever carried the fire, poured into one final blow, aimed at the heart of a wound in the world. And Gray Seer Thanquol, at the base of the engine, saw the golden light gather and understood in an instant of perfect clarity exactly what was about to happen and exactly how little of it could be stopped, and did the one thing it had been planning, in the back of its clever, cowardly mind, since the first night it felt this golden terror shiver the ceiling of the world. It ran. United States. The words filled the cathedral of the wound, and the green light guttered before the gold. And for one instant, the whole seething horror of the Under-Empire's heart went still. The plague priests, the warp teams, the herald reaching through the tier, all of them caught in the impossible fact of a light that did not belong in the deep places of the world. And Grey Seer Thanquol, sprinting for its private tunnel with its robes hiked and its staff clutched and every shred of dignity abandoned 3 warrens back, did not look over its shoulder, because Thanquol had learned long ago that the creatures who looked over their shoulders were the creatures who died, and Thanquol had made an entire unnatural lifespan out of not dying. Smash. The fist came down on the base of the engine, where the 13 spires met, and the world answered. There is no honest way to describe the blow, because it was not really a blow. It was the last of a dying man, and the last of a dying man who carried within him the accumulated will of 8 predecessors, the whole lineage of a power built to be the answer, and it was aimed not at a villain, not at a monster, but at the machinery of an atrocity, at the thing holding a wound in the world pried open, and it struck with a force that was less like a punch and more like a verdict. The engine did not break. The engine ceased. 13 spires of iron and brass and raw warpstone were driven into their own foundations, and through them and into the bedrock beneath, the warpstone detonating not outward in fire, but inward in a collapse, a folding. The whole apparatus crushed into the throat of the rift it had been feeding, and the wound in the world, no longer held, no longer pried, no longer fed, convulsed. The herald screamed. It had been halfway through, a limb of a god extruded into a world it meant to eat, and when the engine died and the rift lost the force holding it open, the wound began to close on the thing that spanned it, and it fought. It tore at the collapsing edges. It flailed green fire across the chamber. It reached, one last time, with an unmaking hand, and Mirko, bleeding from a dozen wounds, standing between that reaching hand and the spent golden man who had just given everything he had, and had nothing left to defend himself with, met it. She met a limb of a god with her body because that was the arrangement, because the spear guards the one who throws it, because Rumi Usagiyama had never once in her life stepped back from a thing she was afraid of, and she drove a kick into the herald's reaching mass with the last of her strength, and bought the 2 seconds the closing wound needed. And the rift took the herald, and folded, and sealed, snapping shut on the god's extended limb and severing it, leaving a length of green horror twitching and dissolving on the chamber floor, and the vast amused attention behind the wound, suddenly, blessedly, cut off. The god did not come through. By the width of a closing wound and the length of 2 seconds, a bleeding woman bought with her body. The horned rat did not come through into the world of Musutafu, and the deep chamber fell into a darkness, lit only by the guttering green of dying warpstone and the fading gold of a symbol who had just spent the last of himself and knew it. All Might did not stand for long after. He had thrown the punch he had been saving for the end of his life, and it had been the right punch, aimed at the right thing, and it had cost him exactly what he had known it would cost. The gold ran out of him. The symbol of peace folded inward into the gaunt, hollow-cheeked skeleton beneath, blood at the corner of his mouth, and he sank to one knee in the ruin of the engine, and breathed, and did not smile, because there was no one to reassure, only Mirko, collapsing beside him with a grin that was half triumph and half the loose delirium of catastrophic blood loss. And Aizawa, already moving, already applying pressure to the worst of her wounds with hands that shook, already keying the surface for extraction, already, because this was who he was, because the war did not end just because the heart had been broken, thinking about the next problem. Because the heart was broken, the rift was sealed, the god was cut off, the horde was still there. Thanquol made it to its tunnel. Of course it did. This was the thing about Grey Seer Thanquol, the thing that made it, in the end, the most authentically dangerous mind in the entire invasion. Not its sorcery, not its cunning, but its absolute and unwavering commitment to being somewhere else when the reckoning came. It felt the engine die at its back, felt the rift seal, felt the horned rat's attention severed from the world with a psychic snap that dropped every lesser Skaven in the deep warrens to the filth in involuntary terror, and Thanquol did not stop running. It ran because it had always known, in the deepest and most honest chamber of its dishonest heart, that this moment might come, and it had prepared, and preparation for one's own escape was the only virtue Thanquol had ever truly cultivated. It fled down a private bolt hole known to no one else, warpstone snuff clutched to its chest, already composing the version of events it would present to the Council of 13, a version in which the failure was Warlord Critch's treachery, and the Scryer engineer's incompetence, and the impossible strength of a golden demon no one could have foreseen, and in which Thanquol itself had fought valiantly to the last and been forced into a strategic withdrawal to preserve its irreplaceable genius for the Under Empire's future glory. It believed this version, even as it composed it. That was the final terrible gift of the Grey Seer's mind. It could lie to the whole world and to itself in the same breath, and mean both. And the invasion, deprived of the god's attention that had lent it purpose, and deprived of the Grey Seer's mind that had lent it direction, did what the Under Empire always did, the instant its central terror was removed. It turned on itself. Warlord Critch, 3 warrens away with an army committed to a now pointless surface breakout, felt the horned rat's eye vanish from the world, and understood 2 things simultaneously: that the great work had failed, and that Thanquol was gone. And Critch, being a Skaven warlord, did not experience this as catastrophe. It experienced it as opportunity. The coward Seer had fled. The blame for the failure could be hung entirely on its absent horns, and the vast army of the Under Empire beneath Musutafu was at this precise moment leaderless and looking for someone to follow. Critch seized it. It declared Thanquol a traitor and a coward, both true, and declared itself the new master of the invasion, and immediately discovered that 3 other clan leaders had had the exact same thought at the exact same moment, and that a warp engineer of Clan Scryer had decided the whole surface enterprise was a waste of good warpstone, and had begun withdrawing its teams toward the deep tunnels home, and that Clan Pestilens intended to abandon the conquest entirely and preserve its precious plague stocks, and that the second Eshin assassin had already vanished to report the collapse to masters who would want to be the first to disown it. The invasion did not end because the heroes defeated it. That was the truth the Commission would spend months learning how to tell the public, and would ultimately decide it could not tell them at all. The heroes broke the heart. That was real. That was the hinge. Without the sealed rift, the whole world was lost. But the Horde was not broken by heroes. The Horde was broken by itself, by the bottomless treachery that was the Under Empire's nature, by the fact that the instant the gods' terrible unifying attention was severed, every clan and warlord and engineer and assassin reverted to the eternal Skaven truth, that the only real enemy was the rat beside you, and the only real prize was to be the one holding the knife. Within an hour of the engine's death, the great invasion of Musutafu had become 100 small wars in the dark, clan against clan, warlord against warlord, all of them withdrawing, all of them scheming, all of them already blaming each other for a defeat none of them would admit was also, largely, their own doing. They got the symbol of peace, and the rabbit hero to the surface alive. That was Izuku's war in the end, not the punch, which was All Might's, and not the wound sealing, which was Mirko's, but the getting out, the cold, competent business of extracting 2 catastrophically spent heroes through warrens that were now, blessedly, tearing themselves apart, instead of hunting the intruders. He navigated by the fading tremor and the mole quirk map and 11 days of understanding the enemy's nature, and he chose the routes where the Skaven were too busy murdering each other to notice 3 humans slipping through, and he got them up, foot by foot, out of the deep and into the gray light of a dawn breaking over an industrial ward where Endeavor still stood, exhausted and soot-black and changed, over 4,000 civilians he had held the fire away from long enough to save. The surface breakout collapsed as the tunnels below dissolved into civil war. The Skaven withdrew, not routed, not destroyed, simply gone, melting back down into the deep from which they had come, taking their poison and their machinery and their numberless selves back below the floor of the world, back to the Under Empire's endless internal wars, leaving behind a city that had come within 2 seconds and a closing wound of ending, and that would never, ever be told how close it had come. All Might lay on a stretcher in the dawn light, a skeleton in a golden hero's clothes, and Aizawa knelt beside him, and neither man said anything for a while, because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already hold. The symbol had thrown his last true punch. Both of them knew it, in the way that people who have spent themselves completely know things. There would be no United States of Smash again. The gold was gone. And the war they had just barely, treacherously, luckily won was not a war the public would ever properly understand. A war with no clean victory to sell, no villain in custody, no reassuring image of a smiling giant standing over a beaten foe. Just a sealed wound no one could see, a horde that had defeated itself, and a handful of exhausted people who knew the truth and would carry it alone. "They'll come back," Aizawa said at last. It was not a question. He had felt the size of the deep. He had counted, as much as anyone could count, the thing beneath the world. Not soon, but they're still down there. All of them. We didn't win. He searched for it. We just closed the door. This time. All Might looked up at the lightening sky, at the city waking above them that would never know, and the dying man found, from somewhere, one more small true smile. Not the symbol's smile. The other one. The human one. "Then we teach the ones who come after us," he said, "where the door is." Far below, in a private tunnel leading down and away into the deep, Gray Seer Thanquol paused for the first time since it had begun to run, drew a long, grateful pinch of warpstone snuff, and looked back the way it had come, not out of sentiment, which it did not possess, but to be certain nothing was following. Nothing was. It had escaped. Again. As it always did. And already, in the tireless scheming engine of its mind, it was beginning to wonder whether this soft, fat, undefended world might be worth a second attempt someday, with a better engine and a more reliable warlord, and no golden demon to spoil things, and whether, if it presented the idea to the Council of 13 correctly, it might be given the honor of leading it. The horned rat, sealed away beyond a healed wound in the world, felt its most faithful and most treacherous servant already scheming its return, and was, in the way of dark gods, quietly, hungrily pleased. Musutafu woke and did not know what it had survived. That was the strangest thing, in the weeks after, stranger than the sealed wound in the deep, stranger than the horde that had defeated itself, stranger even than the symbol of peace reduced to a skeleton on a dawn-lit stretcher. The city simply resumed. The water system was flushed and rebuilt and declared safe, and the official story, crafted by the Commission with a care that bordered on artistry, spoke of a coordinated subterranean attack by an unprecedented villain organization, now dispersed, its leadership scattered, the threat contained. It was not a lie exactly. It was the truth, with its true dimensions removed. There was no mention of a wound in the world, no mention of a god's severed limb dissolving on a chamber floor, no mention of the number Burrow had felt and refused to count. The public was given a victory it could hold, because the public needed a victory it could hold, and Hero Society's oldest and most essential craft had always been the management of what the frightened could bear to know. The sick recovered, most of them. The plague, deprived of the fresh warpstone that fed its anomalous edge, lost its impossible virulence, and became at last a thing that medicine understood and could fight. The industrial ward was rebuilt. The family's Endeavor had held the fire away from, went home to houses 3 blocks from a sealed and quietly monitored breach, and raised their children over the throat of an under-empire they would never know existed, the way the whole city always had, the way the whole world perhaps always had. The Hero Public Safety Commission did not celebrate. The president understood, better than anyone, exactly what had happened and exactly how little of it had been within her control, that the war had been won by a coward's flight and a horde's treachery as much as by the sacrifice of her best people, that the margin had been 2 seconds and a closing wound, that Hero Society had been shown, comprehensively, and in the dark where no camera could see, the exact shape of its own limits. It had met an enemy its entire doctrine could not defeat, and it had survived not by transcending those limits, but by getting lucky at the precise moment its best people spent everything they had. She wrote none of this down. She built, instead, quietly and without announcement, the thing the war had taught her Hero Society needed and had never had, a doctrine for the dark, a small standing capacity, a handful of trusted pros, a map of the deep places, a protocol for the day the tremor returned. She could not make Hero Society into something it was not. But she could make sure that the next time the floor of the world opened, the people who answered would not be starting, as Aizawa had started, from a subway platform with a quirk that did not work, and no name for what they faced. She gave the doctrine to Eraserhead to build, because he was the man who had understood the war before anyone else, and because a war fought in the dark should be entrusted to a man who had never needed the light. Aizawa took it. Of course he took it. He complained about it, in his flat, exhausted way, and he took it, because someone had to, and because he had looked into the deep and felt the size of the thing that waited there, and understood that not preparing was a luxury the city could not afford twice. He went back down, once, weeks later, with Burrow and a small team, to the sealed heart. He needed to see it with the fighting done, to stand in the cathedral of the wound, and understand what they had actually stopped. The chamber was quiet now, the warpstone long since dark, the ruined engine crushed into the bedrock where the last punch of the symbol of peace had driven it, and the wound itself was closed, a seam of faintly discolored stone, a scar in the world, cool to the touch, giving no sign of the horror it had briefly framed. He stood before it for a long time. He did not touch it, and he understood, standing there, the thing he would build the rest of his quiet career around, that the door had not been destroyed, only shut, and that the deep beneath the city was not empty, and had never been empty, and that hero society's comfortable certainty that the world was a thing heroes could hold had been, all along, a story told over a floor no one had thought to look beneath. He mapped the scar, he posted the watch. He went back up. Mirko lived, which had been, for several hours on the day of the sealing, genuinely uncertain. She lost more of herself to that final fight than she would ever fully admit. The wounds ran deep, and some of them did not heal all the way back. But Rumi Usagiyama was not a woman who measured herself by what she had lost, and she came back to the work with the same savage grin and the same bottomless appetite for the fight. And she was, ever after, one of the very few surface heroes the doctrine for the dark could truly rely on, because she had been to the heart and met a limb of a god with her body and bought the world 2 seconds, and she was not afraid of the deep, because she had already been to the bottom of it and come back up. And All Might did not throw another punch. The gold was gone. He had known it on the stretcher, and it proved true in the weeks after. The last true measure of one for all spent at the base of a blasphemous engine, 40 meters beneath a city that would never know. What remained was a gaunt man with a bright and failing spirit, and a role that had changed shape entirely. He could not be the symbol anymore. Not really. Not the way the merchandise and the rankings and the frightened public understood the word. But he had spent his whole life learning that the symbol was never really the strength. It was the belief, the standing between, the promise that the dark could be answered. And a promise, unlike a punch, did not require a body that still held the fire. He became, in the quiet years after, a teacher. He gave what remained of himself to the ones who would come next, the way his own strength had once been given to him. Not the raw power, which was nearly gone, but the harder inheritance, the understanding of what it cost to stand between the public and the dark, and why you did it anyway, and how you held a smile in place for a frightened city, while a wound in the world dissolved a god's severed arm on the floor beneath its feet. He taught them where the door was. He taught them that the world was larger and darker than the rankings admitted, and that being a hero had never really meant being the strongest. It had meant being the one who walked into the dark on borrowed hours and threw the punch nobody would ever film. The city above never knew. The children played over the sealed breach. The water ran clean. The rankings updated and the merchandise sold, and Hero Society resumed its bright and necessary theater over a floor it now, at least at its highest and quietest levels, knew to watch. And far below, in the endless dark of an under-empire that had swallowed its own defeat and moved on the way it always did, a gray seer named Thanquol presented a very particular version of events to the Council of 13, survived the presentation, barely, and by blaming a dead warlord for everything, and began, in the tireless scheming chamber of its cowardly, brilliant, unkillable mind, to think about a soft and undefended world it had very nearly conquered, and about a golden demon that could throw only one such punch, and about how very much of that demon's terrible strength it had personally watched the creature spend. The door was closed. It was not locked. It had never been locked. And the horned rat, sealed away beyond the healed scar in the world, watched its most faithful servant begin, already, to dream of coming back, and settled in to wait, with the bottomless patience of a dark god, for the tremor to begin again. Beneath Musutafu, something still stirs in the deep, and remembers the taste of a world it almost swallowed. Above it, a city sleeps, and a handful of tired heroes keep a watch the sleepers will never know to thank them for. The wound is a scar now. The scar is being watched, and somewhere far below, in the green-lit dark, a horned shadow draws a slow pinch of warpstone snuff, and smiles, and begins to plan. The symbol of peace, through his last punch, and the world was saved, and the world was not told. That is the price, and the heroes pay it, because someone must stand between the light above and the endless dark below, and know, and keep watching, and say nothing. The door is closed, for now.